Welcome back to the Decline and Fall show, everybody. What does it mean when the leader of a country declares that it's a great moment in history, a diplomatic triumph, a tour de force of the ancient art of diplomacy as practiced by the Chinese, perhaps, or maybe the Ottomans, or maybe that Donald Trump himself is writing a whole new chapter in this grandiose world that he lives in, claiming to have solved the conflict 3,000 years in the making, which seems to put Trump's level of understanding of history on about the same level as Roland Emmerich's. Look that up if you don't get the reference. But the discussion today will begin, of course, with our analysis of the Trump plan in Gaza and what that means and what it doesn't. But, of course, as always, with our coverage of stories on the Decline and Fall show, if you dig an inch beneath the surface, a whole lot of decline, fall, and rottenness is revealed. And we will, of course, be revealing that as part of our discussion on Gaza deal today. But before we go any further, I will throw to our co-presenter, comrade, co-conspirator, second name down on the charge sheet. It's Kit Clarenbergen, once and future socialist Yugoslavia. How are you today, sir?
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm well. I'm reeling with amazement at this peaciest peace deal of all time. This flawless diplomatic triumph, which is going to go down in history, and I think should be immortalized by a gold statue of Trump holding a Bitcoin. Not only in Tel Aviv, but in every European capital. This is one for the ages.
Well, if Kosovo can have a gold statue of Bill Clinton looking like he's chasing after an intern, then Gaza can have a solid gold statue of Trump, maybe stood next to Jeffrey Epstein. Perhaps that would be the best way to immortalize him. But, of course, we have to refer to the Gaza peace deal, so-called, and what it means and what it doesn't. Of course, this put the anti-Trump liberal press in the United States in the rather invidious position of having to sell this in a way, look at how the New York Times covered this, going about the whole thing in a way that looked as if they had to reach some sort of accommodation with themselves in order to praise Trump. It must be said, though, when talking about this, that this so-called peace deal is, of course, not Trump's innovation. This was something that was a long time in the pipeline. In fact, this same deal was available in terms of the fact that Hamas and the other Palestinian resistance factions agreed to it over a year ago during the time of the Biden administration. It was Israel and the U.S. that rejected it. So it does raise the rather interesting question as to, okay, well, why are they embracing this now? Why has Trump gone over there and give a ludicrously grandiose speech to the Israeli Knesset, including an appeal to the Israeli president to pardon Netanyahu for any and all crimes because, hey, it's just corruption, guys. And, of course, he took his Israeli or pro-Israel mega donor, Miriam Adelson, with him, and made a load of absurdly grandiose comments. But to my analysis of this, and I'll just conclude my opening with this point, if Israel now is accepting the same deal that they could have got a year ago, to my understanding of the situation, that means that Israel, and by extension the US and the British, came off worse in this in the end. They couldn't achieve the objectives that they set for themselves. They killed a hell of a lot of people. We will not know precisely how many for, I think, months or possibly years to come. But certainly the estimates so far have been probably on the conservative side. But as has become obvious, they were unable to uproot Hamas. They were unable to destroy the very extensive tunnel work that Hamas had dug and fought through to continually surprise and make fools out of the Israeli army. And despite the killing of Sinwar and Deif, and other senior Hamas commanders, including their political leadership, personified in the person of course, Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas in Gaza did not collapse. They retained their organization, their discipline. They even retained their discipline when it came to the treatment of the Israeli prisoners, knowing that these were the bargaining chips with which they could exert pressure on Netanyahu. So, for all of the death and the destruction and the horror that Israel and the United States and Britain have caused, this is a failure. This is a failure. But Kit, I'll throw now to you for your analysis of the situation. How do you see this so-called peace deal?
Well, I mean, it's a joke. I mean, that's the short answer, and I think that yes, as you say, this represents actually like a pretty crushing defeat for Israel, the US, and Britain. I think it reflects the fact that Israel, for a variety of reasons, couldn't keep going. That's from both a public relations perspective. They are so. I mean, they've resorted to paying people $7,000 for a positive social media post now. And it's not having any effect on public opinion whatsoever. So, in international image terms, they're finished. Their various assorted military engagements since this started have been abject failures. The success of Hamas in crushing the IDF whenever the IDF actually dared to step into Gaza was acknowledged in a essay in Foreign Affairs, which is the elite imperial journal published by the Council on Foreign Relations. And they explicitly stated that according to every metric that matters, Hamas is winning. And in the process of slaughtering in the most horrific way all of these innocent people, predominantly women and children, Israel is Hamas's greatest asset in terms of A, recruitment of new fighters, but B, public support for Hamas. Like, support for Hamas has grown significantly in the West Bank as well, because they have demonstrated themselves to be a very effective fighting force that is trying to protect and every Palestinian, whether they're Christian or Muslim, etc. So there's that aspect of it. In their engagement with Lebanon was a damaging, deeply costly failure. Their 12-day war with Iran, if it had gone on any longer, it might have led to the collapse of the Israeli state. Perhaps that's a very real possibility. So I think that yes, Keir Starmer said that there would be a reckoning over what happened in Gaza, and I'm sure that his sphincter was rather tight as he said this, because Britain has been heavily involved. Not only it's not complicit, it's directly involved in the 21st century Holocaust in Gaza. And in the spirit of absolutely brazen cynicism, Starmer has now tried to take credit for helping the ceasefire be enacted by claiming that Britain's recognition of Palestine, which means absolutely nothing, because there isn't a Palestine that could be constructed from what's left of Gaza and what's going to be left of the West Bank when the current onslaught there ends. But I think that for a variety of reasons, it was decided to back off and perhaps try and regroup, retrench, rebuild what's been destroyed. This is an aspect that I've written about fairly extensively, but it's been kind of lost from reporting on which typically focuses on the human, and quite rightly, focuses on the human toll of Israel's genocide in Gaza. This has completely destroyed Israel's economy. It's no longer functional. It is completely dependent on US financing to stay afloat. Entire sectors of its economy have been ravaged. It doesn't have a tourism industry anymore. Its tech sector, which Ben Netanyahu boasted was the envy not only of the region but the world, ruined. And a large number of people. a large number of people were seconded from their workplaces and then killed or severely injured. The psychological toll of inflicting this on the Palestinians has caused mass trauma across Israeli society, and of course when Iran repeatedly struck Israel, this was deeply ravaging to the Israelis. They have every reason to step away from it now. And I might add that on top of this just being a recooked or version, or a kind of pretty much identical version of a peace deal that was available at least a year ago, if not more. Hamas, and this has been confirmed by Israeli officials, explicitly stated in the wake of October 7th, if you agree to not invade Gaza, we'll hand over all the hostages. And so, and this is something that the families of the hostages themselves have been making quite a stink about in Israel, and they have staged protests demanding that the government bring all these people home and work out some kind of deal to achieve that. Now, I think that it's interesting as well that Trump appealed for Netanyahu to be pardoned, because, of course, one of the reasons that Netanyahu has kept this going on so long, on top of trying to fulfill fantasies of creating a greater Israel and leaving Gaza for settlement by Zionists, he was keeping this going to stay out of prison, because he was in he faces very severe corruption charges. And his defense throughout his trial wasn't me, Gov, I've done nothing wrong. It's, well, I'm helping to create greater Israel. I am, responding far more harshly than any Israeli leader in history to Hamas's attack on October 7th. You should acquit me for those reasons. It was, nothing to do with his innocence, because he's guilty as hell. I mean, this is a guy who is so lacking in shame and decorum that he and his wife bring suitcases of dirty laundry to be washed at the White House whenever they visit, which is an almost weekly occurrence now. This solves nothing. It is, to paraphrase a French general in the wake of World War II, this is not peace. It's a ceasefire for an indeterminate period of time. And I think that there are other developments in the region which strongly suggest that there's going to be more conflicts on the horizon, whether they are civil or launched by Israel themselves. I don't know an Iranian who isn't expecting another Israeli attack any day now, despite the catastrophe of the 12-day war. It's far from being this diplomatic triumph, which I noticed that that most of the media is running with this complete fantasy. At best, this is a brief pause which has turned literal hell on earth into just a horrific nightmare for the Palestinians, they can, quote unquote, return to their homes, which have almost universally been destroyed. I mean, in a bitter irony that's not remotely funny as well. The UN a few days ago, or I believe, no, it might have been a few weeks ago now, they dropped a report that got zero media coverage on the environmental impact of the war in Gaza, and how it has basically completely poisoned the environment. Soil has been ruined, water has been ruined, the air is now toxic. So even if Gaza Largo, which Trump and Netanyahu were talking about at the start of this year, went ahead, it would be literally suicidal to live there. And throughout the 78-day-long bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO, which we covered in our two-part epic must-watch special on the breakup of Yugoslavia. That campaign was, during which the US used like napalm and all sorts of depleted uranium and other chemical weapons, which are supposedly banned under international law. That has led to a huge spike in cancer rates throughout the region. There was about, I think it was about 100 separate toxic chemicals were released into the atmosphere, poisoning the air, the water, the soil, the food that people eat. And that legacy is ongoing today with, a lot of people in the region dying far too young from cancer and other terminal diseases directly as a result of the bombing. And that only lasted 78 days versus this is 2 years of relentless destruction.
Declassified UK and other outlets have revealed the precise role that Britain has played, or the British government has played, in providing intel to the Israeli regime is still needs to be fully investigated. The spy flights out of the RAF bases in Cyprus have been ongoing and almost continual over the last couple of years. So precisely what information they were recording and what they were passing with Israel is still not known. We can guess that the British were playing their usual role in providing intelligence on the ground from the ground with regard to the Palestinian forces, and that they were actively assisting with the genocidal Israeli war on Gaza. Again, this is something which has been deliberately papered over or attempted to be papered over by the successive governments. Very few people were willing to ask questions about it. However, it must be said that even some Conservative MPs started to ask questions by this year with regards to the role that the RAF was actually playing over Gaza. So the British role, despite the fact that Trump acts dismissive towards Starmer, shouldn't be underestimated. It's also the case that Britain has continued to train Israeli officers at various different military establishments here. There's proof that they've been servicing Israeli aircraft as well. So the British role in the genocide cannot be stressed enough. So I think we should, whilst it's amusing to see Trump dismiss Starmer, isn't it, Kit? We should not undersell the British culpability here.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, it is worth watching that clip in, kind of frame by frame, because it's quite clear that Starmer thinks that he's been invited to talk by Trump, and he basically just gets, told to, in not so many words, to bugger off once he's approached. And that you can just kind of see his kind of crestfallen face, where he's desperately trying to maintain some kind of smile. And he just looks he looks so defeated. But yeah, the British role beyond the spy flights and the fact that there are military planes that are typically used for ferrying ammunition and weapons that had been routinely flying from Britain's base in Cyprus to Israel. There is in-country training being given to the Israelis. There is a joint British and American intelligence center in Tel Aviv, which is allegedly concerned with freeing freeing hostages. There was, of course, I forget when it happened now. So I mean, this is because so much has happened over the course of this horrific 2 years. But there was a raid which managed to free some hostages and kill a lot of innocent people, including the hostages themselves in the process. And this was supposedly a success of this secret joint intelligence cell. I'm sure that they've been assisting in other areas as well. And also, pretty much the second that this kicked off, Britain's Defence Security and Media Advisory Committee, they sent a D notice, which means basically don't publish, to every major newspaper in the UK, saying, don't mention the fact that the SAS are involved in quote unquote counter-terror operations in Gaza. And you know, we don't have to imagine very hard to understand, you know, what those counter-terror operations consisted of. It's a rather forgotten aspect of, you know, Aaron Bushnell, who was the U.S. Military intelligence operative who set himself ablaze in protest of the Gaza genocide. We must never forget him. But what has been forgotten is some of his friends said in the immediate aftermath that he'd been talking about how he had seen intelligence showing that British and American special forces were going into Gaza to slaughter civilians. So, you know, it is wrong to call it complicity. It is active involvement in a genocide, and I think that you mentioned Tory MPs challenging the government over this. In May last year, there was an extraordinary attack on a defense minister called Hamish Faulkner. He's the son of Charlie Faulkner, a close friend of Tony Blair, and very much implicated in the Iraq invasion, which was just the total crime against humanity. And I believe Hamish, as well as ex-MI6, Kit Malthouse, who's this Tory MP, asked whether Faulkner and the Labour government more widely had received any legal advice for when the reckoning comes over Gaza. They have every reason to try and at least pause this, and Starmer's cynical, disingenuous attempt to suggest that Britain's meaningless recognition of Palestine somehow helped achieve this is a testament to the fact they know that they're up to their necks in this, and that if we actually had a serious international justice system, that they would be in The Hague. But we don't, because in the words of a nameless Western official to Karim Khan, the International Criminal Court is for Africans and thugs like Putin, not the West and its puppets and pets and proxies abroad, of which Israel is numero uno.
Indeed, indeed. And I would also add that the justice system, the international justice system, is of course mentioned extensively in our special on on Yugoslavia, of which, by the way, more coming up in future episodes, because we're coming up to the anniversary of the Dayton Accord. So keep an eye out for coming specials on that. Now, this war on Gaza has been waged, of course, as part of the wider operations of U.S. and British imperialism in West Asia. As the late Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, said in a speech given in November of 2023, this is a war to remove the American and the British influence in the region, starting with, and indeed centered on, Gaza now, but the center of it will move, as he to various different locations. It will cover, of course, Yemen, who defeated the U.S. and British navies twice. It will move to Lebanon itself. It will move to Iran, as we've already commented. The 12-day war with Iran almost led to the disintegration of the Israeli state, given the effectiveness of Iran's missile response to the U.S., Israeli, and British aggression. Now, the one area of potential that the US and Britain and others hope to bring to bear on the resistance axis is, of course, Lebanon itself, which, since the devastating civil war there, which, by the way, was a civil war that began in the 70s and then was actively encouraged by the US, Britain, Saudi Arabia, and others for the specific purposes of completely destroying the Lebanese and wider Arab socialist and communist parties, and which ended with a sectarian constitution being imposed, which meant basically that even though the war had ended, continual instability would be the rule of the day in Lebanon in perpetuity. So with that in mind, both the previous Biden administration and now Trump have been trying desperately to destroy one way or the other Hezbollah, or reduce Lebanon to rubble again and restart the civil war. So the US is, this is from Reuters, US is sending $230 million to Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah. Now, this seems completely and utterly ridiculous, very unlikely to succeed. But and this is a question I'll throw to you, Kit, is it even meant to succeed? Is it just meant to send Lebanon back into a civil war again? Because, of course, there's no way that Hezbollah is going to disarm. And also, Hezbollah itself to be the only effective means of actually defending Lebanese sovereignty against both Israel and the United States.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and it's like the details of this are quite interesting because this story was published. It kind of it didn't really get very much media attention and at all. But yeah, very quietly at the kind of the very end of the U.S. financial year, and of course we're now in a effective US government shutdown. One of the last things that Donald Trump's administration did was approve, yes, $230 million for Lebanese security services to disarm Hezbollah. Now, the Reuters report is at pains to falsely frame the war on Israel's illegal war against Lebanon in October 2024 as a bruising, almost totally destructive failure for Hezbollah, with the heavy implication that, well, once this money's received by the Lebanese armed forces and the internal security forces, that they will very easily be able to disarm Hezbollah. This is absolute fantasy. It is absolute rubbish, and it's dangerous rubbish as well. A few weeks back, we on Decline and Fall, we displayed footage of Tom Barak, this US official, commenting on how the LAF or the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, we're not arming them to fight Israel. We're arming them to fight their own people. But in that interview, he made a number of other comments that weren't included in that clip, which are quite illuminating, where he talked about how Hezbollah has zero incentive to disarm voluntarily whatsoever, as Israel is attacking everybody across West Asia. And he noted that as a result, Hezbollah's argument, which is to say their claim to be Lebanon's protector, old and new, gets better and better, quote unquote. Its public support is growing. Its influence within society is growing. In the spirit of Hamas, the people who are willing to join, the people who are willing to provide assistance to them one way or another, has ratcheted significantly. So I think if in the event that there is a belligerent attempt by the Lebanese authorities to disarm Hezbollah, this could trigger a major civil war again in Lebanon. And the Lebanese the Lebanese military and security forces are going to have a hell of a fight on their hands, because Hezbollah are not a punching bag. They bested Israel during the war using a very limited amount of their capabilities, and they took the assassination of their leadership, which was touted by the media as having decapitated Hezbollah. It didn't affect them whatsoever, really, beyond a brief propaganda loss. But who cares? So there are obvious benefits from the West's perspective to fomenting civil war in Lebanon, because this would allow for Israeli land grabs while the country's in chaos. It would justify, there's already a heavy UN quote unquote peacekeeping presence in Lebanon, which Israel had no compunction about firing on. This could lead to outright military occupation, and it would divert resistance attention and resources to a yet another war. And again, this could be exploited to attack, say, Iran or resistance groups in Iraq or whatnot. There is, as ever, there's another interesting aspect of this, which is that Britain has been keeping a very, very, very close eye on developments in Lebanon. And when Joseph Aoun, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, or Aoun, when he became president at the start of this year, he explicitly stated, "Well, I'm going to disarm Hezbollah," and when Iran expressed displeasure with his comments, he said that, we reject any foreign interference in our internal affairs, which is highly ironic because Joseph Aoun, Lebanon's president, for many years ran the aforementioned internal security forces, who are trained and heavily infiltrated by British intelligence, as is every wing of Lebanon's spying apparatus, to the extent that British contractors, and I think we've discussed this before, like, for instance, Torchlight, they have a dedicated office in the Lebanese military's General Intelligence Directorate. Okay, which results in not only a significant level of influence over how these agencies act and what they do and don't do, but it also offers a vast intelligence yield to London. I've reported on this for the Cradle and my own website that the British are very happy about this. These programs are often run under kind of fluffy sounding titles like professionalization and reform, and then yet you don't need to search very hard to find reports from Western rights groups and even the mainstream media on how the ISF routinely engages in torture and forced disappearances, and they're particularly unhappy about the presence of Syrian refugees in the country for whatever reason. But I think that there have been several parliamentary reports. You can find them on the House of Commons Library website, where they are talking about the prospects for a Hezbollah-free Lebanon. It was reported, I believe it was last year, by a local publication, that Britain was seeking this completely insane agreement with the Lebanese government, which would allow for effective British military occupation of the country, would allow British personnel complete unfettered access to Lebanon's ground, air, and sea territory. They wouldn't need formal government authorization from Lebanese authorities to conduct quote unquote emergency missions. They would be allowed to British soldiers would be allowed to go wherever they liked in their country armed, and they would also enjoy immunity from arrest or prosecution for committing any crime, which has heavy echoes of the Rambouillet agreement, which was presented to Yugoslavia in 1999, which was a deliberate fudge intended to trigger bombing, because it had non-negotiable terms that no government would willingly accept, which are very similar to the terms Britain was seeking with Lebanon. But because Lebanon is so penetrated by the British, they expected it to be agreed, for whatever reason. And we must ask ourselves why they wanted that power and why they might need it.
Indeed. It's just worth emphasizing that for all of the shouting and the screaming from the Israelis and the US and the British about their great successes at decapitating the leadership of Hezbollah, the actual battles in the south of Lebanon all went against Israel. For all of the deadly violence they inflicted, on the Lebanese people, including bombing of Beirut and other major urban centers, and killing a lot of civilians there, and also the aforementioned assassination of the Hezbollah leadership. They failed to break Hezbollah as an organization, and also all of the machinations of the US and the British in terms of intelligence and subversion and sanctioning Lebanon to the point where the economy almost completely collapses. The mysterious, still unsolved massive explosion that took place in Lebanon several years ago. Probably should come back to that at some point in the future episode. But for all of these plans that the US and others have, they can't uproot Hezbollah because Hezbollah are an organic part and a very strongly embedded part of the working class and poor areas of southern Lebanon and Beirut. And no one has a comparable level of organization. And the colonial or neo-colonial army that the British and the Americans have armed and trained to do, as Tom Barak says, their dirty work for them, would stand no chance against them. And this is part of the reason why I think that Hezbollah kept a lot of its capabilities back, just in case the British and the Americans moved to push their local puppets into triggering a renewed civil war. Because they would have no compunction about doing that whatsoever. They've done it before when they thought it would be advantageous to them, and they would do it again. The problem for them is that their position now, vis-a-vis, if we do a comparison with the mid-70s, the reactionary forces in Lebanon are actually weaker now than they ever have been. Hezbollah's prestige is much higher. So if they try and trigger a renewed civil war, what they could actually end up doing is triggering a war of national liberation, which Hezbollah would lead as part of a shall we say, a united patriotic front, let's say, which would actually do what Nasrallah said was necessary, which is, removing the British and American influence. And now, of course, a nation like Lebanon has options that it didn't have 10 years ago. It certainly didn't have 20 or 30 years ago, which is in terms of trade, in terms of economic relationships, etc. In fact, the US was pressuring Lebanon not to do any business with Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, not to go near BRICS and stuff like that. Well, if you freed Lebanon from the influence of the US and the British, then a lot of the problems facing that country would disappear, given that the stunted economic development, the crisis in the financial and banking system, all of this goes back to the fact that the economy is entirely controlled and in the hands of people tied to the US and Britain. And Lebanon's been kept deliberately underdeveloped. And this is, as we've covered before, this is how neocolonialism operates. Britain and America control the government, they control the security forces, they create and arm and train the army to carry out internal repression, and they control the economy via various different relationships that they have with people in the Lebanese political establishment. So you remove that influence, then Lebanon is free to develop. This is the thing. You can't argue now, really, that having a relationship with Britain and the United States leads to development. You could tell that lie 30 years ago. No one believes it now. So as a consequence, all that the enemies of Hezbollah have got left, really, is religious sectarianism, a la Giuliani and HTS type people in Syria. And that's about it. Because you can't make a positive case for relations with Britain and America, nor really a positive case for relations with their other puppets, such as Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, who don't bring anything other than immiseration wherever they go either. So the British should be very, very careful what they wish for here. And the other point to draw this discussion around is that, of course, Israel, in the original Lebanese civil war, the one that took place from the late 70s to the early 90s, tried to do a massive land grab in Lebanon. What they did was they helped create Hezbollah, which defeated them in 2000, defeated them in 2006, and defeated them last year as well. So if the US and the Israelis think they can carry out some insane scheme to grab some of southern Lebanon, I mean, there was rumors, of course, that Erdogan was interested in obtaining northern Lebanon as well. So, but we'll see if he fancies chewing on that, given that his Syrian acquisitions aren't looking too promising at the moment. But I will conclude my comments on this by saying that the resistance movements, if they're very well rooted in the population, can't be removed by all the schemes that the US and Israel and Britain have at their disposal. And any attempt to reignite the Lebanese civil war will only, I think, rebound very, very badly on the US and Britain and Israel, just as in the end, the Lebanese civil war ended up producing a long-standing, very strong national liberation movement in the form of Hezbollah, and gained Israel ultimately nothing. But Kit, I'll throw to you for your final word on this topic.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think that yeah, it's interesting that to a large extent the legacy of attempting to keep Lebanon, this kind of dysfunctional colony, not only of the Anglo-Americans but also the French. It's a bitter boomerang that it has created such a high level of public discontent about the state of affairs amongst the local population, a deep-seated distrust and dislike of the West, and a very, very effective resistance force, which is not only, it must be stressed, a military formation. It's also a major force within society. Even if they were disarmed, they would remain enormously influential on politics, on the public. They again, such is the way of these things. The West appears to have very much painted itself into a corner here, and yes, there are alternatives to being completely overrun by the British and the Americans, and they're cropping up all over the region. We're seeing more collaboration and cooperation and trade between China and countries across West Asia. If there is a civil war, it will be horrific. It's certainly not something that I want to happen, but Hezbollah, it could result in a Lebanon that is run by Hezbollah, which would strengthen the resistance and would also turn Lebanon towards BRICS potentially. And there's another point to make as well, which is that we mentioned that we have a planned special on the Dayton Agreement, which supposedly ended the civil war in Bosnia in the mid-90s, but actually just created a vast number of unresolved problems which persist to this day in every regard. That was signed when at the kind of when the US empire was at the absolute peak of its kind of unipolar power. Lebanon's likewise completely unworkable and overly complex political system, which all but ensures inertia and friction and tension, is likewise a relic of imperialism, and it wouldn't take very much for it to spectacularly unravel. Because the countries that drafted it don't have the muscle or the wealth or the appeal they once did.
Well, yes, and just to round off this discussion and perhaps pivot into our next item, the war with Iran waged by Israel was, of course, a total disaster on many levels, because it revealed so much about the weakness of Israel and the United States' inability to actually defend it properly, given how much they had to mobilize to try and defend against waves of drone and missile attacks from Iran. And Iran didn't even use the great bulk of its more advanced weaponry. Also, in terms of backfiring, what they ended up doing was they ended up pushing Iran into a comprehensive cooperation agreement with the Russians, which was stalled before the war due to internal disagreements in Iran between the so-called moderates, which are in reality pro-Western bourgeois in Iran, and the more revolutionary faction centered around Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. The war waged by the US and Israel on Iran completely destroyed the power of the so-called moderate faction. Politically speaking, they then had to go and sign this agreement with the Russians, and it would not have been the thing that someone like that ridiculous little creep Zarif, former foreign minister, now advisor to Pezeshkian, the president, wouldn't have wanted to do that. They ended up having to do that. The Chinese and the Russians are now openly helping to rebuild Iran's air force in a way they weren't before. Iran's air force, if you recall, was based on jets that the Shah had bought off the US in the 1960s. Some of them as old as like as 70 plus years old because they were bought in the 50s. Now, the Russians are upgrading and updating the Iranian Air Force with first MiG-31s and then more modernized Sukhoi fighters. So the air supremacy enjoyed by the US and Israel in that war for the first few days is going to go away. The Iranians will have fully operational and a fully operational air force modernized by the Russians with apparently also new air defense systems, both from Russia and China coming in. So all they've done really is push a new generation of Iranians more behind the revolutionary leadership and also at the same time strengthen Iran's international relations with its two powerful, really neighboring states, Russia and China. So it was a total, utter failure on every single conceivable level. Now, moving to the broader picture here and perhaps pivoting into our next story, this brings up the question of the military alliances of the West, which are supposedly oh so powerful, and which are, of course, talked about endlessly by the people identified as NAFO. Perhaps, Kit, you might want to mention what some of those people get up to in their spare time is part of this segment, but we've written about this week. But just to mention the question of NATO, we discussed this very much in depth as to its purposes last week. But it does finally get something of a mention in the British political scene in a negative sense, which is that Zara Sultana of your party fame / infamy, and by the way, if you haven't watched our special with Professor David on your party, then be sure to do so. But Zara Sultana something quite useful in terms of that she's come out and called for Britain to leave NATO. Now, I think that this is something which is somebody with a national political profile, or relatively high profile, has come and said it. The problem with just coming out and saying it is that Sultana doesn't appear to have adjusted any of her previous position in actual fact, informed purely by Foreign and Commonwealth Office and MI6 press releases. For instance, Sultana was loudly in favor of the regime change war against the Assad-led Syrian government, and then complained about the inevitable sectarian butchery immediately afterwards, as if that was not obvious that what the so-called rebels were all about. She has loudly called Putin every name under the sun and denounced the Russian special military operation. She also has engaged in peddling of frauds like the so-called Uyghur genocide, which again, a very funny genocide when the population of the region of Xinjiang markedly increases over the last 20 years. And so the problem with coming out and saying that you're anti-NATO, whilst at the same time agreeing with the British ruling class position on Russia, echoing the talking points about Syria, echoing the British FCO MI6 talking points about China, is that, well, you're not leaving yourself with a political leg to stand on. because all that your political enemies, including the pro-imperialist left, personified by like some in your party and the bulk of the Green Party, including its very pro-NATO leader, Mr. Polanski, no relation to the disgraced film director, or so I think. They are all pro-NATO and all screaming about Putin and back Ukraine, and all basically taking their lines from show favorite Paul Mason. Unless you're prepared to actually go out there and contest the central justification for British membership of NATO now, which is Russia, which is the Ukraine war, which is by extending like the Syrian war and China, but particularly if you're not prepared to dispute the ruling class narrative over Russia and the Ukraine war, then your position will just collapse under pressure. The pressure that will be brought to bear on you, because as we covered last week, membership of NATO is big money. It's very important for the British ruling class. So they won't tolerate a major national political figure making this case. So unless Zara Sultana is prepared to come out and say that the Ukraine war is a British operation, a British provoked war, a war that the British government and ruling class wish to continue for their own purposes, and reveal all of that and be prepared to take the political hits, then this position's not going to last. And I quite seriously extended an invitation to Zara Sultana to actually come on the program and discuss all this. And I'm not taking the piss. Like, this is something that I think would be a very positive development if somebody with a major national political platform in perfidious Albion was prepared to actually go out there and take the political risk of contesting the MI6 line on Russia. But I'll throw over to you, Kit, for your analysis of the situation. And so what do you reckon to this rather strange position that Sultana's taken, which is saying that Britain should leave NATO, but agreeing with all the pro-imperialist talking points on the designated enemies of Britain?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that, on the one hand, Zara has come out swinging in way. I think this is exactly a point that we made when we just chatted with David Miller. If you haven't caught that broadcast, if I do say so myself, I think it's a must watch. And we get into a number of issues around the party, and more widely, the question of opposition to NATO within the kind of established European left framework. Namely, Die Linke, for example, which is Germany's party, its name literally means the left. There are WikiLeaks cables in which Die Linke representatives, very servilely reassure the US embassy in Berlin that their policy of disbanding NATO, they stand on it to attract anti-NATO sentiment, because there is a large anti-NATO sentiment within Germany, and they do so specifically to ensure that NATO remains untouched, because it's not Germany that's going to lead the dismantling of NATO. They're not in any position to do that, even if they wanted to. This is an Anglo-American organization to its core. It is one of the key. I mean, Zara's comments on this, if you actually break down what she was saying, it was actually like pretty pedestrian, saying like, well, look at the wars in Afghanistan, look at the war in Iraq, even though that wasn't a NATO invasion. That's kind of perhaps besides the point. Is that like her comments fail to actually cut to the core of why NATO is so toxic and what it actually is and what purposes it actually serves, and how it from Britain's perspective, it is a key means by which Britain, quote unquote, punches above its weight internationally. It's not, like the downsides of NATO membership aren't just, perpetual war and being forced to buy crap US military equipment. The downsides are a lot graver, actually, than that. And I think as well that it should never be forgotten that our friend of the show, and perhaps also someone we might invite for an interview. I'm sure he'll just report us to the police or something. Chris Donnelly, this completely lunatic, long-time Ministry of Defense apparatchik who was a senior NATO advisor. He led, even though the US was keen on NATO expansion, there were elements of the US power structure who were dead against it. The British were all in on it, despite knowing it was going to gravely aggravate Russia, and Chris Donnelly led it. And they were well aware that they were expanding their power into traditional Russian domains. And that the Russians were going to be very unhappy about it and probably respond, but they did it anyway. So her analysis of, if you can even call it that, of NATO was not particularly sophisticated, not particularly impressive, not very controversial. And I think even when, yes, and particularly given her track record on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is explicitly the product of NATO expansion. We know from declassified declassified. We know from WikiLeaks diplomatic cables that in 2008, Bill Burns, who served as the head of the CIA under Biden, was explicitly stating that in the wake of the 2008 NATO conference, stating that Georgia and which we'll get into later, and Ukraine would become members in future. And, that this was the reddest of red lines for the Russians. And it is an issue, Ukraine's NATO membership or lack thereof is an issue that unites Russians like no other across the political spectrum, from Putin's most ardent supporters to his sharpest critics, are all against this happening. So it's like to see her have adopted all of these bullshit talking points and kind of Foreign Office and State Department approved lines on how this is Putin's war of choice and aggression, and it is Ukraine's this plucky underdog democracy fighting off an authoritarian dictatorship and all this blah blah blah. It does raise serious questions about A, her actual understanding of these topics, and B, the sincerity of her positions. And we mentioned how she was a tub thumper for the fall of Assad. Like, literally 24 hours after Assad's ouster, which she instantly cheered as a victory for people power. As you say, the new MI6 or sponsored Al Qaeda, ISIS, and Al Nusra tied government of Syria began massacring ethnic and religious minorities, including the Druze and the Alawites. But not only that, Israel began expanding further into Syrian territory and illegally annexing more land under the guise of having concerns about security. And Sultana was complaining about this, and it's like, well, this was an inevitable and widely predicted upshot of what you aggressively advocated for. If we were to get her on the show, I think it would be interesting to probe whether she's had any self-reflection on issues like that, and what her level of comprehension of all of these kind of foreign fomented crises and proxy wars overseas actually is. I mean, I'm not particularly confident it would be very high. A lot of her anti-Israel comments get people excited, and she's openly professed herself to be anti-Zionist, which Corbyn refuses to do, leading some to conclude that he is actually like a closet Zionist. I think he's just a timid old man, really. But that's by the by. The point is I think, yeah, we should be extremely careful about cheering when someone like Zara Sultana it makes actually quite uncontroversial statements. Like, if you look at polls, the overwhelming majority, even if the questions and all the answers aren't framed in this manner, the overwhelming majority of the world's population are anti-Zionist. Like, it's not this kind of lunatic fringe position at all. So what she's saying is not particularly radical or groundbreaking at all.
Mm. Well, I think they're also like, I mean, this is why I think she would never come on the program. But if she did, we would have. Well, the invitation remains open. Maybe we could have her and Chris Donnelly on together. The point is to draw on what you were saying there. Unless you're prepared to confront the reality of what the British role in the world actually is, and that takes a lot of unpacking, maybe more unpacking for somebody who's like on the soft left, on the middle class left, because they are the people who have fallen for every propaganda piece about the officially designated enemies of the British government since, well, at least World War II, arguably earlier. And central to that is something that we've talked about before, which is the human rights narrative. And we've talked previously about the Helsinki Accords and what that meant in terms of the West scoring a huge propaganda victory that was all one-sided because there was never any these standards applied to their own countries. But the Western left, and I think Zara Sultana represents this perfectly, bought all into all of this liberal framing. And therefore, as a consequence, whenever an anti-imperialist state or a socialist or a state that's building socialism tries to repress its enemies, all the Foreign Office and MI6 have to do is go, look, repression. Look, they're repressing these bold freedom fighters who just want, to express themselves, by usually butchering women, hanging minorities, and shooting anybody who threaten their property. Usually, or he threatened to break off relations with Britain and the United States. Example, of course, Giuliani himself, who, thanks to his podcasting work with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart of, again, intelligence fame, we can tell who he was always working for. But the Western left always refuses to do this. They always refuse to come to take on the human rights narrative and not only reveal it to be hypocritical, but also reveal it to be something which is deliberately designed to stop anti-imperialist governments actually defending themselves. What it's always been about is the telling nations like the former Soviet Union, like the former Yugoslavia, like Syria in the Ba'athist era, like Burkina Faso now, to basically stop repressing our employees. That's what it's about. Because the people who are trying to overthrow anti-imperialist governments are normally the employees of MI6, the CIA, Mossad, all three. And again, you can spell that out in a way that I think even the public in perfidious Albion would probably understand, but it would mean you basically being isolated within the political establishment and isolated on the British left, because almost nobody outside of a few isolated Marxist-Leninists is prepared to make the statement that the British government is, living up to the name, the most perfidious force in the entire world, including the United States. Now, you should make that argument if you're in a position of responsibility, and you should take a lead on it. I don't anticipate that she will, but I remain, and we remain, open to the conversation, Zara. So if you're watching, reject the siren song of Paul Mason and come on the Decline and Fall show.
Indeed, as unlikely as that is, I think it would certainly be interesting, and it actually might help your party's credibility a lot more than, say, Jeremy Corbyn. Immediately after the party's launch was announced, going on Owen Jones' show. Owen Jones, of course, having previously worked overtime to ruin um, uh, ruin Corbyn's leadership, and also so you see, wrote a book for the over. Okay, all right, yeah, and then wrote an entire book undermining Corbyn and smearing him and his supporters as anti-Semites. So, I mean, on the subject of NATO enlargement and the dangers of pushing up into Russia's traditional sphere of influence, the European Court of Human Rights has rather oddly issued a demand that Russia pay a quarter of a billion euros to Georgia over the 2008 war. Now, the court claimed that Russia had committed violations, including excessive use of force and had unlawfully detained people and across the administrative boundary line between Georgia and the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This is very, very, very weird because number one, Russia is no longer part of the European Court of Human Rights, so this is completely unenforceable nonsense. But moreover, according to an independent EU commissioned report, which runs to 1,200 pages and is extremely forensic and detailed, I must admit I've not read it all, but it does contain many interesting passages. It is very clear that the war in 2008 was started by the Georgians. But not the Georgians themselves, but specifically the West guy in Tbilisi, Mikhail Saakashvili. Theories abound as to why he did this, whether he thought that the NATO declaring that Georgia was en route to becoming a member might have emboldened him. The country was already at that time crawling with US military advisors. Its own military had been trained, funded, armed, clothed, even fed by the US for many, many, many years. In the parlance of the great journalist Mark Ames, much like Delta Airlines outsourced its call centers to Mumbai, the US empire was seeking higher returns for lower costs by outsourcing its military operations to the Georgians. It must also be noted that there were several, such as the contempt Washington has for its vassals. There were many Georgian soldiers who were trapped in Afghanistan after the US pullout because they hadn't been told the US was leaving. So they were stuck there for several months afterwards, I believe. But anyway, the point is that this seems like a very bizarre intervention to be staging at this time. The question obviously arises: is the EU trying to offer this kind of like very lame token fig leaf to the Georgian Dream government after spending the best part of 2.5 years trying to overthrow them and encouraging people and protesters to try and storm parliament, and EU officials and European member state leaders flying out to Tbilisi to give public speeches, like during the Maidan protest, saying get rid of these bastards and smearing them falsely as Russian puppets. That could well be an explanation for this. I'm racking my brains for any other as to why this is now almost 20 years later. They've decided to try and fine Russia for offences it allegedly committed during a war that Georgia is confirmed to have started.
Well, I can't see it being any other motivation because, but also it's a rather pathetic attempt because Russia is not part of this court system anymore, left it a while ago. There's no way that 253 million sounds a lot of money in terms of euros, not a lot of money in terms of settlements between states, not a lot of money compared to the cross-border trade value that the Georgians now enjoy with the Russians. A lot of which, by the way, is sanctions-busting stuff, which Western companies are engaging in, because that's some way to get your stuff into Russia these days through Georgia and also through the various different Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. So this is bizarre. Is it meant to make? It's probably meant to do two things. One, fire up the Georgian Maidan crew with the reminders of the war in 2008. But it's unlikely to move the bulk of the Georgian population, who, lest we forget, didn't want Saakashvili. Saakashvili was imposed on them and got rid of Saakashvili after his disastrous intervention in South Ossetia led to the war, which destroyed his presidency and almost destroyed the Georgian state. It was the fact that the Russians didn't want to conquer Georgia which saved them in that war, not the US, not the amazing training that the US had given the Georgian armed forces. The fact is that, again, to go back to what you were saying about the NATO expansion plan, the NATO expansion plan was agreed to by Saakashvili. It also, by the way, been assented to, but not as enthusiastically, by that foul old rat, Eduard Shevardnadze. May he long rot in whatever hell he finds himself in. But the Georgia Dream government, initially pro-EU, initially pro-NATO, was pushed into a corner. Essentially, it seems the threats were coming, I would argue, the threats that mentioned by Kobakidze and other Georgian government officials seem to have been coming probably from the US, but I think also from Germany and France, given their big role in Georgia. I.e., they were pushing the Georgian Dream government to literally commit suicide by reigniting the 2008 war, which rather sensibly, the Georgian government, who are by no means radicals of any description, decided this was a terrible idea and continue to resist it. So quite what this is meant to do, though, is strange, because they're not going to get any of this money. The Russians wouldn't pay it out. It's a relatively small amount in terms of what the Georgians would lose if they went down this route. What it shows, really, is that the EU is running out of options when it comes to Georgia. They're running out of things that they can offer. And just sharing here on the screen the fact that all the way back in 2009, an EU-backed report found that Saakashvili was responsible for the war. The current Georgian government say that he was responsible for the war. And they've clearly made a decision that they're going to try and exist in a space that puts them between the Western US-led bloc and the Russians, though in reality, the rabid hostility and the, frankly, lunatic behavior of the EU officials towards Georgia is just pushing them further and further into the Russia and Chinese corner, which makes complete sense given where Georgia is. Like all the talk about Georgia having a Euro-Atlantic future, it's nowhere near the Atlantic. I mean, geographically speaking, how can they possibly insist with a straight face that Georgia will benefit more from being in a Euro-Atlantic trading bloc than being in an Asiatic one? It doesn't make any sense. If you're Georgian, you don't have to be some sort of anti-imperialist to look at where you are, look at the way your trade routes are, look at who your neighbors are, and think, well, we do better with relations have with China, Russia, and Iran than we would with the EU, which is so far away and which produces exceedingly little that Georgians would actually want anyway. So it's a pathetic attempt, as you say, to sort of rebuild their forces, shall we say, in Georgia. And I think it's doomed to failure because they tried a color revolution again last week with that idiot French citizen, former president Zurabashvili, saying she was going to go into the presidential paths. It failed, then claimed ludicrously that the whole thing was a put-up job by the Georgian government, despite the fact that she'd been out there a few days before saying, now is the time. So I think we go from the tragedy of 2008 to the farce of today, do we not?
Indeed, and I think that I mentioned earlier Mark Ames. I think I brought up this article probably more than once on Decline and Fall. It remains an extraordinary piece of journalism. It was written after Mark visited the site of the fighting in September 2008, and he found that the Russians were absolutely speedballing off their 3 or 4 day lightning strike of Georgian forces, which saw U.S. military advisors running away on foot to the Sheraton Hotel in Tbilisi, and drowning their quite literally drowning their sorrows. And it ends with this rather chilling warning that, this is a sign that the U.S. empire is dead. Like, I mean, this is the point at which it's all going to start unraveling, and with any luck, we can exit from the world stage without causing too much damage to other people or ourselves. No lessons were learned from this whatsoever. You have Maidan 6 years 5.5 years later, and everything that's led us to this point now. Lessons continue to be fair to not be learned within the halls of power in Washington, in Brussels, in London. I mean, you got to bear in mind that an EU commissioner openly told the Georgian prime minister, in trying to threaten him, threaten the government into not passing foreign agent registration legislation, said, well, look at what happened to Robert Fico in Slovakia. A very obvious implied death threat against them. I mean, and they think, if they seriously think that, and actually measly, the Euractiv report, and it uses the phraseology $250 million. I mean, that's 253 million. It's in terms of monthly trade. Whether that's directly between Georgia and Russia, or Georgia being used to get Western goods into Russia or get Russian exports kind of guilt free. This is a tiny drop in the pot, and it also as well it furthers a narrative that not only the current government but the general population do not accept, which is that Russia was responsible for this. And I think also as well, this ties in with what will be our final item this week, is that I think that we are constantly provided with palpable examples that are almost more ludicrous than fiction, which testify to how the EU is on this completely self-destructive path. So it's got nothing positive to offer except empty theatrics and rhetoric. They're not offering Georgia Dream anything serious and try and mend fences and try and rehabilitate their image, not only with the government but also with the general population, which did take a hit because of the actions and statements of EU apparatchiks. But they are also consistently doing things which show that they can't be trusted, and are offering active disincentives to people to want to join or do any business with them or hold money with them or whatever. So this story that you've got on screen now, Alex, it's actually quite extraordinary. It effectively amounts to there was a Dutch company. There was a Netherlands-based company called Nexperia, and it was ultimately owned by a Chinese company, and it employs over 10,000 people locally. And because of the US explicitly telling the Dutch, well, you're in breach of our attempt to prevent China from getting access to microchips and etc. We're going to sanction you, or there will be punitive measures. So the Netherlands basically unilaterally seized a Chinese-owned company. Maybe there'll be some short-term gain on this. I mean, the attempt to hinder China's development so far has not only not worked, it's backfired. But also as well, like what Chinese company in any sector is going to want to do business in not only the Netherlands but Europe now? I mean, this was an issue which people like yourself and I raised at the time of the kind of state appropriation of Russian assets at the start of the start of the proxy war. Is like Germany was boasting about like stealing oligarchs' property, as if this is this major win. Well, if they could, I mean, oligarchs are, not, deserving of sympathy, of course, but like a lot of people kind of ask themselves, like, I mean, the government this is just confirming the government can at any time take your property away from you if it wants. And serves as a huge disincentive to foreign countries, as I say, doing business with these governments or having significant financial interests in these countries. It's insane, but hey, they got this short-term win out of it, which will last all about 5 minutes.
Yeah, and the Chinese government immediately responded by essentially telling the Chinese arm of this company that they could no longer export to the Netherlands, and essentially that they were taking the Chinese assets under the control of the Chinese government. So any attempt to sort of subvert things inside China has already been squashed. This is, as you mentioned, a tacit admission of defeat by the EU, because both the EU and the US under Biden tried to wage a chip war against China. This was behind the infamous CHIPS Act that Biden unveiled a few years ago, and was a giant subsidy to US tech companies. Might be part of the reason why there's a huge bubble around AI at the moment, partially because like so much state investment got directed towards the tech sector. I mean, a lot of it went into boosting stocks, which is now horrifically overvalued certain tech stocks. That I think the CHIPS Act might have done something with regard to that. But just on the what they were trying to do, they were trying to cut off China from getting chips from companies like Nvidia, chips produced by the Taiwan-based manufacturing company that the US bullied essentially into opening facilities in the United States, and trying to stop Chinese technological development by denying them Western-produced tech, the chips, and also the manufacturing processes, lithography processes, which the Netherlands had like a leading role in, like that kind of production in lithography. Now, Xi Jinping, Chinese president and general secretary of the Communist Party of China, set a national challenge in response that China should become self-sufficient with regard to these chips and going into Chinese products, and that they shouldn't be exposed to this risk of having to rely on US and European imports of these chips anymore. And it's a mark of their success that not only did Biden and now Trump's attempt to cut them off fail, but they stimulated the Chinese tech sector under Chinese government direction to now produce their own version of these, which actually perform just as well as anything from the West. So it's a complete failure and a complete disaster from the policy-making point of view. They've completely failed at what they were planning. They tried to derail Chinese development again, only ended up making themselves look weak and pathetic. And it should also be added, and I think we should come back to this next time, that given the crisis in the major European economies, given the crisis in the US economy, the only for economic power with the ability to potentially bail these European countries, including Britain, by the way, out of the hole that they have filled with, should we say, effluent. The only power in the world who could actually do that would be China, which is why the Telegraph a couple of days ago was running hyperventilating headlines about Britain being exposed to Chinese debt, because they're the only ones that could bail out the pound when things come down to it, not the Americans, not anybody else. No one else is going to want to do it. Yet at the same time, the US is insisting, and the European ruling classes are going along with, lashing out at the only power in the world that could possibly save them from economic freefall. So good luck, guys. It's clearly going to go well.
Yeah, it's been nice knowing you. And I might add as well that the Chinese government has been consistently paring back its dollar holdings and its holdings of other currency its kind of Western currencies, which shows that when another financial crisis hits, which could be any day now, I think that there is an AI bubble that is very much ready to pop. Enormous valuations have been given to companies on the basis of their AI products, which serve no real meaningful purpose, are actually in many ways very harmful. China has managed to undercut them in every way, producing low cost, low energy alternatives, which are actually quite useful. You have I saw some stats the other day to suggest that like the only growth in the US economy has been due to since over I think it was like 2 or 3 years was like a massive overinvestment in AI firms that don't in some cases don't really have a business model, let alone a serious plan for turning a profit, or doing much of anything apart from maybe assisting the CIA and NSA, in secret. But we could be on the verge of that, and China is making abundantly clear with its actions, we're not going to help you out this time. Like they did in 2008 following the financial crisis. So, again, actions like this, it is shooting your own leg off, let alone your own foot. It's alienating the one country that could assist you at a time when things are, to say the least, rocky. And on that bombshell, that's us for this week. Thanks so much for joining, guys. As I say, we've got some exclusive investigation. We have some exclusive interviews as well coming, which were again, if I do say so myself, are going to be unmissable. So like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned. God bless you. Take care.
See you again next week, everybody.